Kentucky this afternoon to learn about the history and impact of school vouchers with Josh Cowen, the author of The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. This information is important in understanding the second of two amendments that we'll see on our ballot this November. Amendment 2, if passed, would allow the legislature to spend taxpayer money on private schools in Kentucky. As a nonpartisan organization, we don't support or oppose political parties or candidates, but we do take stances on issues. The League supports free public education. The League has taken a position that taxpayer money should not be used for anything other than supporting public education. It should not be used to subsidize private school tuition. The League is encouraging people to vote no on Amendment 2, and we're alerting voters not to be misled by materials received in the mail from special interest groups that fail to share the whole picture of this debate. Our conversation today should help make our concerns more clear. We hope that you will take away from this talk several points that you can share with your friends and family. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Josh Cowen. Dr. Cowen is a nationally recognized expert and writer on topics related to school choice, teachers and teaching, policy analysis, and education politics. He has studied school vouchers, school accountability, charter schools, and parental decision-making as part of major research teams in Louisiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. His writing on school vouchers, culture wars, and other current events has appeared in major media outlets, including Slate and Time magazine. He speaks and testifies across the country on the dangers of school privatization, and he's regularly quoted in state and national feature reporting. In addition to his appointment as professor of education policy at Michigan State University, Dr. Cowen has also served as one of 5 national directors of the National Center for Research on Education Access and Choice, or REACH, which is based at Tulane University. In 2016, Dr. Cowen founded the Education Policy Innovation Collaborative, EPIC, a strategic partnership or research partnership between Michigan State University and the state of Michigan. He's held a variety of editorial positions for major academic journals and was co-editor of Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. That's the premier education policy journal in the United States. His research has been funded through federal, state, and local government contracts, as well as a diverse array of philanthropies, such as Arnold Ventures, the Russell Sage Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation. Josh Cowen holds a PhD and MA in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Master of Public Policy from Georgetown University, and a BA in history from the University of Michigan. Before beginning his research and writing career, he worked in CNN's Washington, D.C. bureau and on staff for the political debate show Crossfire. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you find the chat is distracting, you can close out of the chat window. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, Professor Cowen, and I turn it over to you.
Wow, that was very kind of you. Can everybody hear me okay? I always have to check. Am I able to share my screen? I don't know with the webinar, but if so, I have some pictures I want to put up.
I can do that. I think you should be set.
Okie doke. So I am going to do that right now. And so what I'd like to do, if you all don't mind, is take about 15 minutes or so just to sort of tell you a little bit about these schemes, these voucher schemes, and then just if we can have a conversation, take questions, things like that. Does that work for everybody? All right, all right. I see Jen there, so I'm gonna all right. So and by the way, I was just asked last minute yesterday. I was in your state. I was down in Lexington with Governor Bashir uh, and Randy Weingarten speaking about this to at a church at a press conference there in Lexington. Um, so I spoke for 5 minutes. I'm going to speak a little longer today, but the message is going to be roughly the same. Vouchers defund public schools. They devastate student learning and discriminate against vulnerable kids and families. That's what Amendment 2 would do in your state, and this is what you're seeing other schemes like what would be authorized in Amendment 2 doing already in state after state after state, where we've been looking at this for a very long time, unfortunately. I'm going to gloss over this because it was just super kind introduction already touched on this. The only thing I want to sort of add is this piece sounds very bureaucratic and red tape about partnering with state agencies and working with districts and different governments over the last 15, 20 years. But it's kind of important to the story, both for vouchers and my role in this whole conversation nationally, because a lot of what we know about what these things do comes from independent evaluation and analysis that was done in some cases on behalf of states in the early days of voucher systems and even over the last decade through what are called research practice partnerships. So basically states contract out with someone like me or other researchers, think tanks, things like that to audit and evaluate an existing public policy, in this case vouchers. But there's nothing unique to vouchers in these partnerships. And although I began my research career studying vouchers and have been sort of working in that space for a very long time, the other piece of this is that we kind of know what these things do. And we know because until just a couple of years ago, states that were passing vouchers were actually very willing to kind of partner and share data and explain how these things are working. It wasn't until the results came in, and the results are sort of historically level dreadful. That kind of there's been this new chill and shutdown in the way that different states kind of go about studying and asking questions about these programs. So I just kind of want to say that up front because the news is unfortunately almost uniformly bad when it comes to the types of programs that would be allowed under Amendment 2 if it goes through in your state. Just kind of want to level set here for a second. Tax credits, education freedom accounts, education savings accounts, vouchers, they're all different ways of saying private school tuition covered on the taxpayer dime. And in every single state that these things have passed, students have to leave public schools to get them. And that's really what defines a voucher from my perspective. Does it pay for private school tuition, K-12? And do students have to leave public schools to get those dollars? All the other kind of different tax credits, different savings accounts, higher ed savings accounts, childcare tax credits, all these different things, they're different policy vehicles for accomplishing a certain goal. And this is an important distinction because the other side on this question is going to kind of throw a lot at folks. I know what's happening in your state. It's not a voucher. It doesn't authorize a voucher. That's a tax credit. It's a scholarship, whatever it is. Does it pay private K-12 tuition? And do you have to leave public schools to get those money? If so, in both of those cases, the answer is yes. The answer is it's a voucher. All right, more level setting. It's actually a few months old now. This is a chart put together by researchers at Georgetown. 2024 has added 4 more states to this, but why am I here today? Why am I talking to you all? Why are you fighting this thing in your state? Well, unfortunately, it's not about Kentucky kids and families. It's about, frankly, right-wing billionaires who are doing this in every other state or all the states they can try. You don't have to be a math whiz to look at this picture and understand what I'm trying to tell you here. Vouchers are on the march. They've been increasing. 24 states since 2021 have passed or expanded voucher systems. Regardless of what you call it, vouchers, tax credits, whatever it is, these things are spreading. So in Kentucky, as in Nebraska, as in Colorado, on election day this year, vouchers are on the ballot. No state, though, of all these states here and all these different bills, these are all legislative deal making, ramming vouchers through, usually by primarying out hesitant rural Republicans who don't like these things for their own reasons. Vouchers have never, not once, survived a statewide ballot initiative. So if Amendment 2 were to pass, that would be the first time ever that actually voters, like real people, wanted these things, and not just sort of backroom deals in state legislatures, usually by getting threatened with big outside money in a Republican primary. The other side on this is one of the big interest groups here that sort of cooks up data on these things. They're saying the same thing. They call this freedom, but they're crowing about this. They're crowing about taking public dollars and using it for private school tuition. And I just want to kind of underscore, not to diminish the specifics on the ground, and that are specific to the Commonwealth over there, but I really can't stress enough. This really has nothing to do with what's best for Kentucky families. This is entirely a national right-wing movement. All right. We know a lot about what these things do to state budgets. They usually come in over budget, and I'll explain why that happens in just a second. But I want to stress that whatever dollar figure you're seeing put on something, I know they're trying to kind of stay away from specifics right now, but the dollar figure is always bigger than what's promised. One of the tricks that gets tossed around, this came up yesterday in a question to the governor at the press conference that I was at. Somebody asked about kind of the cost of these things and what happens if you pay for a freedom account or a savings account or a voucher, and it's not coming out of school aid in the Kentucky budget. Isn't that not a voucher? The answer is that's BS. There's only so much of a pot to go around in a budget. It doesn't matter, a state budget. It doesn't matter if the dollars for a new account, a new voucher authorized under Amendment 2 would be taken directly out of school aid or some line item right next to school aid in the budget. There's still only so much to go around. And when you get to an Ohio or an Arizona or a Florida, and you're talking about 600 million to $1 billion a year, you can't do other things. It slows down spending on public schools. It slows down spending on roads. It slows down spending on clean water initiatives. In Arizona, to meet the corrections budget, to get that thing whole in that line item, the state had to borrow against its opioid settlement fund because of this $1 billion hole in the budget caused by vouchers. So this argument that you hear downstate right now about well, it's not going to come out of school aid, is like me saying that gas prices have no impact on my ability to pay a mortgage. Maybe a very, very wealthy person, if gas prices are $10 a gallon, they're not going to affect paying their mortgage. They may not even have a mortgage. Most of us, though, in our budgets, gas goes up or food goes up. We got to find the dollars to pay the other bills, right? The other mortgage. It doesn't matter that it's not in the Excel spreadsheet that says mortgage. And that's really how this works here. The money has to come from somewhere. There's no free lunch. Here's why it gets expensive. In state after state after state, about 3/4, 70% to 75% of voucher users already in private school to begin with. These are new expenditures. So when Bluegrass Institute or kind of one of these kind of right-wing researchers says, no, there's going to be cost savings. What they're assuming completely incorrectly and based on, I don't even know where they get these numbers at this point, but what they assume is that most kids are going to be most voucher users are going to be transferring from Kentucky public schools into private schools. And that there's going to be savings involved because whatever the voucher cost is going to be less than what the state is spending per child in public schools. The problem with that is that that's not actually what happens. Again, about 3/4 of voucher users, and there's 8 more states to add to this graphic. I just want to kind of show you what this looks like, though. Most voucher users are already in private school. These are new expenses, is what I'm trying to get at. So it's not a cost transfer. These are new hits to the state budget that 2 years ago, last year, were being borne by the private sector. And now the state is obligating itself, and that's why the costs go so far over budget. Before I get to that, let me just sort of put a bookmark on this and say that's not to say that the individual districts losing a handful of kids aren't suffering costs as a result of that. But it is to say that the really big hit to the state budget comes from the fact that new users are coming disproportionately from private school already, and those are new checks the state is writing, not transfers. So what happens to the 30% or so of kids who do transfer from a public to private school? I said 70% are already there. That means 30% are new. Well, what happens is we see some of the largest declines in the history of education research on any research question for kids who switch from public to private school. The bigger and the more recent the voucher scheme, the worse the results have been. That's what this graph shows. The thickness of the line is the number of kids, and the direction is, did it help their academic trajectory, or did it send it nosediving? The answer is it sent it nosediving. Ohio, Indiana, Louisiana, and DC, the 4 states we have data on for this. Kids transferring, suffering catastrophic academic loss. You have to go to something like what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores, or to what the COVID-19 pandemic did more recently, to get at the magnitude of the learning loss here. And the reason for that is very simple. And it goes back actually to this fact that most voucher users are already in private school. The schools that have room, the schools that are willing to take kids coming from these public schools, they aren't any good. And not to put too fine a point on it, they're what I call subprime providers, financially distressed. Often they close anyway. 40% of voucher receiving schools in Wisconsin, where I was working, 40% closed, even with the voucher bailout. Those elite schools, I used to live in Lexington 5 years. That's my first faculty job. Sayre is a good school, isn't taking vouchers, okay? And if it does, it's going to raise tuition. It's going to price out it's going to price out kids who would have had an opportunity anyway, and it's going to have selective admissions. It's not going to take those schools, those kids. And that's true in every other state we've seen. It's not picking on Sayre here, but that's what happens. These are not the Sayres that these kids are going into, despite the name, despite education, freedom, opportunity, hope, whatever it is. That's not what's going on. These I call vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending, and this is why. A lot of messaging about how kids are needing to leave failing public schools. In reality, they go to private schools that are just terrible. And the results stay. Unfortunately, these bad drops, they last for years. So the other side has, at this point, the data are so inarguable that not even pro-voucher advocates will argue. If they know what they're talking about, they won't even argue what I just said. But they'll say, well, no, give it time. There's always a give it time. It's how you know you're getting sold a bill of goods by, I don't care if it's on your doorstep or from a legislator or from a right-wing think tank in your state funded by out-of-state billionaires. If someone's telling you give it time, next year will be better, I promise. They're usually full of it, at least when it comes to public policy. That's how you know the hucksters are getting involved. And the answer is that's not what happens. The results stay for years. A little bit of good news. It is true that when you hold these private schools accountable, when you tell them that their results are going to be broken out and reported by school name, just like publics have to, when you hold those private schools that taking voucher funds to the same standards public schools have to follow, the voucher schools do improve. They don't necessarily exceed the public schools, but they do get a little better when they know they're going to be held accountable. Unfortunately, that's what this slide says. So, and our team was able to kind of track student data for a long time, for 5 years in Wisconsin. And this last year, in the last year of the study, the state decided to report out individual school names. So just like happens every year in the spring on public schools. And the results, lo and behold, got better. Unfortunately, though, all of the new legislation in that first slide I put up shows none of that new legislation has any accountability whatsoever. And the reason for that is they don't want any more headlines like this. This was done right. This headline came right before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, they have not allowed evaluators to come in, look under the hood, and see how these programs are going, because they don't want any more of these headlines. They say parents are happy, parents are going to where they want to go. It doesn't matter. Public schools, those tests are for you. Private schools, publicly funded, no tests for you. And that's kind of where we're having things. I'm looking at the time. I'm going a little longer than I wanted to because I do want to get to Q&A. So I'm going to skip to a couple just final points here I want to make that to kind of tile this up. I've talked about defunding public schools at the beginning. I've talked now about how they devastate student learning. I want to say something very specific about the discrimination part. We can go over some of these, but when it comes to vouchers, it's the school's choice. It's not school choice. I can't stress this enough. The private schools are doing the picking. And except on the basis of race, and even there are ways to get around it, but except on the basis of race, private schools can discriminate against any of these children or their families as long as they say the child is not consistent with that school's creed or values. Or in the case of students with disabilities, they can just say, we don't really have, we don't do that. We don't have room for, we don't do this dyslexia training. We don't do hard of hearing. You're gonna have to go to the public school for that one. Problem is, in the GAO, the federal government's watchdog agency, did a report about this a few years back. But the problem is these private schools don't say that. They might say we don't do this. They're very into the value piece. They will say in some states, in Arkansas, for example, we're seeing a lot of private schools have students having to sign, and their parents sign what they call sexual morality pledges in those private schools to get to use the voucher to spend there to get admitted. That just means I promise I'm not gay. My parents aren't LGBTQ. I won't get pregnant out of wedlock. In some cases, maybe I'm not a child of divorce. Schools can pick as long as it fits their quote unquote creed. They can turn you away. It's a little harder to do on this disability piece. The schools are not quite as eager to share the information on this one. So they'll say, well, we will teach your kid how to read, but we're not going to be on the hook for that IEP, that contract that says we actually have to do what we said we would do. So just trust us. We'll come in. 30% of children leave vouchers every year, 25 to 30. They're disproportionately lower scoring on whatever exam the school shows. They're disproportionately lower income. We know they're disproportionately children with special needs who do go into that, and they're disproportionately students of color. Kind of just going to stop here, unfortunately, and just sort of say this is kind of, I've got more and I can talk about more on why we're in this moment, if you all would like, because the answer, in my view, and frankly, this is the book's argument, that the results are devastating, and it's not about academic opportunity for kids. It's not about hope and change for kids. It's really just about culture wars. It's really about there's a reason that everybody on listening to me here knows that we've had an uptick in book bans. We've had an uptick in this very strange, overwhelming obsession with where kids go to the bathroom in public schools. We've had Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. I know Florida gets pointed out a lot in your state right now as a model for what all the great things that can happen if vouchers come to town. I know Bluegrass is doing that right now. Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, just a few weeks after signing what's today the nation's biggest voucher scheme, he pushed through a curriculum for Florida public schools that said that slavery had economic benefits for enslaved people. And then 2 weeks later, when given a chance to sort of tweak his statement on that, he doubled down and he said, no, blacksmithing. There's a reason we're talking about vouchers in the same moment as book bans and bathrooms and suggestions that slavery had economic impact for kids in the 19th century. And there's this focus on what public schools are and aren't doing. We're in this moment. None of this is an accident. And it's really about that. And it's really not about new opportunities for kids and families. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I guess what I will do is put this up if anybody does want to read the whole book, because you can get a discount with this QR code if you'd like. Um, but yeah, I'd love to just have a conversation with all of you, and uh, and we can kind of go from there. So I will stop sharing my screen. Did I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, yeah. So we do have some comments and questions in the chat. So Cindy Heine was asking, proponents are saying that voting yes will raise teacher pay. Please comment.
Yes, I keep hearing this. Nonsense. I mean, that's my comment. There's no credible study that actually shows this. Uh, the argument is something to the effect of, well, there's two things. One, the Arkansas voucher bill included a provision just totally separate from it, had nothing to do with the voucher piece, but to get extra votes, they rammed through. I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. To get extra votes, they rammed through the voucher scheme alongside a pay increase for starting teachers. Did nothing for existing experienced teachers. So maybe that's what they're talking about. They'll also say that class sizes will go down because more kids are leaving public schools, and so there's going to be still teachers there, and class sizes are going to be going. That doesn't happen either. The argument here is that districts will pay teachers more because they want to compete, and they will lose teachers otherwise. Like all of this hangs on this idea that has never actually come to fruition, that when vouchers come to town, they do everything but cause substantial academic loss and substantial defunding. And as I said in a piece that I wrote for the Herald Leader last week, or maybe it was the week before, a week ago, I think, the 3 or 4 credible studies that do show that in Florida, uh, public schools lifted test scores by just a little bit when vouchers threatened competition. Those there's a couple of credible studies that show that, but the effect sizes are tiny. So something like moving from the 50th to the 50.2 percentile, far smaller than the positive impact of just directly investing in public schools in the first place. So if this is your argument, teacher pay, more investments, just pay the districts more. You can't backdoor these things. And there's no substitute for just investing in the thing you want. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So let's see, next comment. Cindy Heine is also asking, why do millionaires want vouchers?
It is true that vouchers without income caps, like we're seeing today, no real income caps like in the old days there used to be. Wealthier families are using vouchers now, and that means more those are some of those students that are already in those private schools, as I mentioned. But when we're talking about mega rich people, oligarchs, Betsy DeVos lives 50 miles from me, Charles Koch over in Kansas, Jeff Yass in Pennsylvania, those 3 right-wing billionaires contributing most of the money to these voucher pushes, including in Kentucky. This is about remaking American society the way they think it should look. It really isn't for those billionaires about profit. They don't need the money. There are on the make vendors and sort of operators that come in after the carnage and kind of try to make a buck starting a for-profit school, or being a service agency that helps parents find a voucher school, or you've heard about these kinds. That part's true. There's a little bit of money to be had, but that's not why Betsy DeVos is spending money in Kentucky right now. It's not why Charles Koch is spending money in Kentucky right now. It's not why Jeff Yass is spending money in Kentucky right now. It's about remaking the country in the way they want it to look. Betsy DeVos has said that public schools became the centers of community, and I lament that fact. Churches should replace public schools as centers of community. She sees vouchers as a way to, in her words, advance God's kingdom. Billionaires, at the end of the day, are just like you and me. They all see the world as it is, and they want it to be the world as they think it should be. The difference is they have billions of dollars, and they can try to make this thing look the way it should be.
All right, thank you. Let's see, next question is, well, Karen Brown made a comment, read the book, it is very enlightening. Gail Henson's asking, given the language of the amendment, could Muslim schools be excluded? We have several in Louisville.
So this is coming up, good question. This is coming up in other states. Most of it, it has not happened yet. Muslim schools, Ron DeSantis tried to kick out a couple of schools in Florida that he said were tied to China. I mean, I don't know what gets these people going. I mean, honestly, but they uh there's some sort of weird tie that some school had some curriculum or some investment from a Chinese company. I don't know. They tried to kick out some schools with plausible ties to China, and it didn't even work even in Florida. Legislators on this and churches generally are pretty leery of getting it. They do see this as kind of a slippery slope. And the other thing is that it's important to understand, I do say this in the book, and I've said this in other public writing on this, the whole theory of action behind these voucher schemes is one of isolation and one of exclusion and one of separation and one of balkanization. They don't deny Muslim children exist or students of color exist or gay children exist or gay families anyway exist. Some might, but their argument is we shouldn't all have to interact, at least not in schools. Most of them will say that Brown versus Board of Education was wrongly decided in 1954. And those that don't go that far, at least will say, well, parents who didn't like the Brown ruling at least had a point. Milton Friedman wrote his first voucher idea in just a few months after Brown v. Board on the basis that parents should have the right to go to a segregated school if they want to, is what Friedman claimed in his essay, Inventing Vouchers. So when you look at it from that perspective, vouchers kind of solve that problem as they see it. They would support, many of these right-wing backers would support a Muslim school for the simple fact that those children aren't going to school in public school with their kid or at a church school with their kid. The whole point is to separate, isolate, and balkanize children in the name of school and parent values.
Okay, let's see. Moody asked, have there been any successful suits brought against states using public dollars to fund parochial schools?
Well, you guys had one. I mean, so the courts have, in some cases, decided against these voucher schemes. Your Supreme Court said that this is why you're doing something that's proposing to do something so radical as to change the Commonwealth Constitution. Supreme Court saw it for what it was and said this is call it a tax credit has the same revenue impact on the state budget as a voucher scheme. Correct. South Carolina, this year I'm spending a fellowship year at the Education Law Center, which was helps to litigate a case in South Carolina. The South Carolina Supreme Court found something very similar for their state's vouchers program. This was just a few weeks ago, in a narrower decision, a 3-2 decision. But the court said all this window dressing aside about paying the money going to the parent, the argument for these people is, well, if you're giving everybody a coupon, you're not actually giving it to the school. You're just giving it to the parent, as if the parent just shoves it in their pocket and walks away, right? Parents have to go spend it somewhere. And the Supreme Court said, in South Carolina said, that's all window dressing. This is a voucher scheme and it violates our state constitution. There are other court cases being litigated right now. There's a big one in Ohio that could go a long way to kind of changing or affecting the legal landscape here in this country, at least at the lower courts levels. But since the 5-4 decision in 2002 at the U.S. Supreme Court, same 5 judges who at that time had recently just handed the presidency to George W. Bush. Since then, the Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly in favor of voucher schemes. In 2022 was the last pro-voucher ruling 2 years ago. And in that ruling called Carson v. Macon, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 vote, said not only can voucher dollars go to religious schools, which had been decided for some time by then, but can go specifically toward religious education within those schools. It's not uncommon for states to partner with private vendors for all kinds of services, whether it's education or other types of public-private partnerships. But the difference has been what they can do with those dollars. And the Supreme Court said, in the case of education, they can use it for religious education. In Carson v. Macon, 3 days after that decision, those same 6 right-wing justices rolled back 50 years of reproductive freedom in this country for half the people here in the United States. So it really is important to sort of see all this as part of one larger kind of conversation. Generally speaking, lawsuits have had a lot more success at the state level. They have not had much success when it comes to the federal courts.
Chuck has a comment. It says, won't poor counties be hurt much more with private school funding?
Yes. So shocker of all shockers, there aren't very many private schools in most poor counties, whether Kentucky or anywhere else, and or rural counties. So the funding loss to those districts doesn't come from those handful of kids transferring that I mentioned. The funding loss comes from the fact that the states just can't afford long-term to keep up with spending. So, the other side will claim we've had, I don't know, 10 years worth of adding to the per pupil fund every year. That doesn't mean anything if you're still well underfunded. So if I put $10 in my bank account, but the thing that I'm trying to invest in costs $1,000, I guess it's nice to have 10 instead of 0, or 10 instead of 1, or 10 instead of -10, taking money out. But it's not going to actually pay for the service that I'm looking for if the service costs $1,000, unless I borrow and go into debt. That's what happens here. So the state may be adding a little bit more money to the per pupil fund every year, including to those rural districts, to those poor districts, but it's not enough. And it's never going to be enough until the state decides to pay for it. And it can't pay for it if you're spending $600 or $700 million on a voucher scheme that's not benefiting kids in those counties in the first place.
I'm going to go back. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead because this kind of talks about with the parochial school. So D. Pregliasco says that even with the lawsuits against parochial schools, isn't the religious liberty argument what will get the cases to the U.S. Supreme Court, conservative Supreme Court?
Yes, absolutely. So the end goal here is to not have to do this piecemeal state by state by state, Kentucky, Nebraska, Arkansas, whatever. The end goal is a new ruling at the U.S. Supreme Court that says that vouchers are mandatory in every state, on the logic that for some religious families, education, and specifically religious education, is a fundamental core activity of their religious faith. And that by only spending money on a common school system, a public school system, the state is somehow discriminating against those religious families by putting undue financial burden on them to have to pay for their religious education instead of secular education. That's the argument that they're trying to make, and they're trotting out in state courts right now. Betsy DeVos, in her kind of exit column she wrote for USA Today before she left office, said this is what our final goal is. The Cato Institute's big Koch group affiliated at the national level with your bluegrass group down there. They are pushing for this very hard right now. Federal courts have stopped short of doing that right now. But this is the argument. This is the long-term goal, and you're already seeing it pop up in state level litigation.
Chuck has a comment and says the problem with the Kentucky proposal is its lack of specificity leaving all decisions with the legislature.
I agree. But the bill's already been written. I mean, it's been written in every other state. Uh, I am not an expert in voucher schemes in each state because I am an expert in the economics and demographics, political history of every single state in this country. Uh, I am an expert in these voucher schemes because I've read the legislation and it's actually not that, it's actually fairly efficient to read because it's almost all the same. They get written at the national level and then shoehorned into each state lawmaking process. The other thing to remember is legislature already did pass one of these things. So just what the Supreme Court threw out is a good place to start. Now, the language in Amendment 2 is specific enough that they could just make it a voucher scheme in the first place, and not go through this tax credit business. The reason they do that, by the way, is the tax credits do the same thing. So a tax credit system, as we're describing it here, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's one vehicle for doing this. They use that to try to get away from state courts. The same exact, almost exactly the same tax credit system that your court threw out, I believe it was 2 years ago, blessed in West Virginia, the state Supreme Court in West Virginia blessed an almost identical package just a few months before that. It really just depends on the exact wording of the Constitution and the makeup of the court. But what is the same is what happens is donors, either wealthy donors or corporations, pay into a voucher fund instead of paying what they owe to Kentucky in state taxes. And then the state just distributes, or that fund, it might be privately managed, but it just distributes a voucher that way. So it has the same effect on a budget as just directly spending the voucher dollars, which is what your Supreme Court recognized back in 2022 when it threw this thing out. The reason the other side wants it, even though it has the same effect, is it's just politically, this is true in education, it's true in other areas too, not just education. It's a lot harder to get rid of a direct appropriation when it's in the general fund than it is a tax credit that you could plausibly sunset later. Illinois is the only state to get rid of a voucher program, and it got rid of its tax credit version, the type of thing that your state would have had your Supreme Court ruled in a different way. So it is harder, and then that's true again across the board, to zero out a budget line down the line. So that's probably on play. But the other side on this, they want to say, we don't know what Amendment 2 would do. Don't worry, it's not a voucher system. And then yet all of the arguments in favor of Amendment 2 come from voucher evidence as they see it from other states. So let's not get too cute about this. If what they claim are the good things about voucher bills in other states is enough of a reason to vote for Amendment 2, then all of the horrific things that I'm telling you about voucher bills actually do in other states is a good reason to vote against Amendment 2. We don't have to kind of overthink this too much. And that's not to you all to the question. I just mean the kind of sort of shell game that these groups are playing with data and information is pretty remarkable. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Francis Cotton is asking, Kentucky Amendment 2 will change the Constitution if passed. In other states, were there constitutional changes?
There have been constitutional changes over time. There's been nothing so overt and nothing has ever passed. So there have been attempts to do this, but to completely redo the Constitution to make it happen, that hasn't happened yet.
Becky Jones asks, doesn't Kentucky already have a 529 savings account option administered through KHEAA, and those funds can be used for tuition for K through 12 tuition?
Yeah, I think Kentucky is one of the states that do that. So some states do allow their 529 to be used for K-12 and some don't. My state doesn't. I don't have a complete list. I'll take your word that Kentucky's on that. Should have checked into that. But yeah, that is one way that this can happen already, which does make some of this superfluous a little bit. The other side would say not everyone has a 529. Not everyone has the kind of income they need to save for tuition in a 529. And that's not wrong, but it would be a lot more it's not a good faith argument because they don't target these voucher schemes for the very people who can't afford to save into 529. They target them to everybody, to universal folks. They might begin small at a certain income level, but they target them to universal folks today. So and those include people saving in their 529s already. So remember, 70% of voucher users is already in private school. Whether they're using a 529 to help pay for it, I don't know. I'm sure some of them are. But the point here is that the state is not targeting this legislation for those people who are too poor to pay for tuition right now. They're targeting it to offset and to give subsidies to kids who are already in private school.
Bill Brown asks, what about education and training for teachers in private schools? Public school teachers do not receive their certification until the conclusion of their first year of teaching. Will it be the same?
Good question. Different states have different rules. So that is one of those details that probably would get hashed out in the legislature. Some states require some type of teacher certification. Most don't. Some states require some form of private school accreditation. A couple don't. The private school accreditation thing doesn't mean a whole lot. It really just means there's a building that you can turn the lights on and it doesn't have asbestos. It's not a fraud address. That may sound snarky, but in North Carolina, they don't require accreditation at all. And there's been some reporting there. Some of the watchdog groups there have found schools that literally don't exist and are still charging the state for dollars. So at least if you get accredited, it means the school exists. It's a low bar to cross for these things, but in Arizona, on the far extreme end, teachers don't even need background checks. Forget certification. The Goldwater Institute, sort of the sister group, every state has one of these through the state policy network. In New York State, it's Bluegrass. In Arizona, it's Goldwater. Wisconsin, it's the Badger Institute. In Ohio, it's the Buckeye Institute. And they all talk to each other. The Goldwater Institute is dead set against it, and they've been fighting very hard to keep background checks on teachers away from requirements for the voucher system there, on the idea that like parents know best, it's education freedom and things like that. So it really just the devil's in the details on that one. But suffice it to say, they're gonna push through whatever they can get away with, as little as they can get away with.
Leslie Marcelino asks, has any state proposed or passed been, has any state proposed or passed being able to carve out voucher legislation for one or two counties like Kentucky's might be heading?
Yeah, so Tennessee is doing that right now. Look to Tennessee. It has the three biggest counties. Governor Lee is trying to expand it from 3 counties to the statewide system. It never stops at 3 counties. He has not been successful yet expanding it. Some Republicans still remain opposed to expanding the voucher scheme there. But Kentucky, not just for being just north of Tennessee, but that's kind of the roadmap they're following.
All right, thanks. Let's see. Is homeschooling supported in most voucher states? Seems that is where parents are the teachers and have the control. Does that pull them into the pro voucher cohort? Are there reasons homeschoolers are hurt by Amendment 2? Seems homeschooled special ed kids would lose services if districts are hurt all over.
Yeah, good question. So the homeschool advocacy organizations, as I understand them, are fairly divided on this issue. Some absolutely want these bills to pass because one of the newfangled things about these voucher schemes is they're vouchers plus, so they're the private school tuition with additional add-ons for homeschool expenses, or for, in some cases, anything you say is an educational expense as long as you're not in public school. And so some homeschool organizations want that. Others are really worried about what you're describing, don't really want to partner with the state, aren't assured about the fact that there's really very few strings attached to these voucher schemes for homeschool expenses too, as long as they're not enrolled in public school, but still don't want anything to do with it. So there is a divide here, and I wouldn't know how to speculate about how exactly that debate's playing out in Kentucky, except to just say nationally the homeschool groups are split on this issue.
Gail Henson asked, in Louisville, we have 27,000 youth in Catholic schools. What is a good response to their statements? We deserve a break since we have to pay. and the public schools are failing. Just look at the scores. Why would we want to be there?
Well, the first thing I'd say is if you're pointing to test scores about public schools, let's talk about those test scores for private schools. I showed you what happens when kids leave those public schools for voucher schools, including the Catholic schools in dioceses like Louisville. So if we're going to talk about test scores, let's talk about test scores and let's talk about how voucher kids do. I'm not saying every public school is exactly where we would like it to be performance-wise, but as long as test scores is the corner of the realm that we're going to use to judge public schools, then it's fair to look at how they would do in a private school. And I'm telling you that the best comparison, look at Indianapolis, not that far from Louisville. Indianapolis is one of the sites for that catastrophic learning loss for kids who transferred from public to private school, overwhelmingly Catholic schools in Indianapolis. They nosedived. So I'm not persuaded by the diocese argument on this one. Certainly not when it comes to academics. But on the other side of it, this is a big argument others are made. I just weighed in this yesterday. There are a bunch of Catholic groups saying, "Save our Catholic schools." Betsy DeVos has an entire organization, a campaign within her national 501c4 devoted to just calling it "Save Our Catholic Schools," and they're trying to whip up support among parents for saving Catholic schools using voucher schemes. They're making no secret of the fact that these voucher programs are intended as bailouts for Catholic schools, and that just depends. That's an argument. That it just depends on whether you think that bailing out Catholic schools because listen, I'm a Catholic. Just before I get into this piece, let me say that baptized and confirmed. There's a reason that a lot of big archdioceses are strapped for cash. And it has nothing to do with failing public schools. It has to do with some very poor, nefarious, and insidious choices these dioceses made to cover up decades of sexual abuse. So I'm not persuaded by the idea that all of a sudden taxpayers need to come in and bail out these Catholic schools. And I'm certainly not persuaded by the idea that these Catholic schools are going to do any better using vouchers than the public schools around them are doing. The evidence just doesn't show that at all whatsoever.
Becky Jones asks, what, if any, is the general shortfall percentage or dollar amount between a state's voucher amount and the actual cost of private or parochial tuition?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it varies by state. I mean, so I've always found it curious that these voucher advocacy organizations lean into the idea that they skimp on the cost of educating children. Like they'll sort of say 6,000 per kid should do it. If you ask parents in surveys, credible surveys anyway, focus groups, they really spending education dollars is actually something parents generally really want. The private schools, what we've seen in Iowa and we've seen in Arizona, is the private schools raise tuition. You still hear me? Did I go away? We've seen the private schools raise tuition by at least more than 10%, which is sort of a number. Still better.
Now you're back.
Sorry, I'm getting I'm one of the many people getting blasted by political calls these days, by like, and every time that happens, it screws my sound up. So what I'm trying to say is that voucher schools have raised tuition when we had the data to show it in Iowa and Arizona. They will say they're raising tuition to meet costs that they've been bearing themselves until the public dollars came in. It's not clear that that's actually true, but private schools can set some of their own costs. It's also one of the reasons why it's kind of BS that the teacher pay will go up in the public schools. We know private schools and charter schools notoriously pay teachers less anyway. So I think public schools should pay teachers more, but the idea that public schools have to pay teachers more because the private school down the street is going to pay even more to compete, that's not actually what happens. Private schools tend to skimp on teacher pay and pay far less than public schools even do, even though all these schools should pay these teachers more. I had some other, one last thing. The schools are actually in Iowa and Ohio are forcing parents to apply for the voucher and use the voucher before they become eligible for any private financial aid through the school themselves. So, which is rational. That's what these voucher bills incentivize. Um, uh, so this is just all of this is about public subsidy for the private school costs, whether borne by the parents or borne by the school right now.
Karen Brown states, with the lack of transparency practiced by our state legislature, how can we trust that citizens will be allowed to participate in writing any legislation concerning vouchers?
I'm not sure there's a way to trust that, to be honest with you. There are always public hearings, there are always legislative sessions. If the votes are there, they will get these things through, and it usually doesn't look very good for public school kids and families. I wish I had a better way to end, but it's if you take nothing else from this, take it as a warning. And I do try to close with a better message at the end on the books, and that's basically we do know that public school spending works and it works well across the board for kids, but most of what I have today is a warning.
And I think we're slated till 1:15. Are we okay with that, or I know we're coming right up at 1 o'clock or.
Yeah, that's not what I have. I have a 1 o'clock meeting, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
I'm so
all right.
sorry.
Yeah, well, we can close out. Definitely thank you so much for your time, and we really appreciate you speaking with us today. I will add there's a call to action. So everybody, again, like learn more about this issue. You can read this book, and if we can get that information with the like QR code and the discount code, then we can share that if that's okay. I
will send you the whole slide deck.
Oh, okay, great.
And at the end will be the QR code.
Okay, great.
You're welcome to share that around.
We also have, so we have a great way to make it easy for you all to share information, and that's our League in Action app. So you can download that for free from the Play Store or the App Store, depending on whether you have an Android or an iPhone. There we have the ability we have information about Protect Our Schools, and we make it easy because there are pre-written text messages and email messages that you can share out with your contacts. There is actually an action right under that shows you how to do that in case you don't know how to do that. And also we just want you to be able to share your feedback about this event with us, so we can make sure that that we're improving our programs. And I'm going to drop that in the chat. And again, thank you so much, Josh, for your time. And yeah, and I will let you go to your meeting.
Whoever has my email, if you can just send me an email, I will reply to it with the PDF of these slides and the QR code with the discount as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. We've got a ton of opportunities. We've got a ton of opportunities for volunteering. So we'll share our Mobilize, and we'll do that in a follow-up email. Thanks so much.